All right, so talked about vision, we talked about light waves, talked about uh, visual sensation in a previous narration. Now let's look at more at how we turn light waves into mental images. So we're going to talk about perceptual organization. So we have perceptual processes for enabling us to organize perceived colors and lines into objects. Okay, we've seen those. Uh, but if we get more into the perception side of things, we talked about in the past, we've talked about putting all together through parallel processing and configuring that light sensation that it started with into actually seeing objects and things. Okay, we get into a perceptual side of things, which goes further in terms of what we see. Okay, we've got some perceptual processes that help us along. Okay, and that sort of basically influence what we see. So we have a tendency to group incomplete parts into wholes. We call them gestalt wholes. Okay, we've heard the term gestalt, which means the big picture, the whole. Uh, Seeing figures standing out against background. We perceive form, we perceive motion and depth. We keep a sense of shape and color constancy. Okay, even though the visual information is changing constantly. We've seen how our experience guides our visual interpretation. So let's look at the role of perception in all of this. So our senses take in the blue information on the right. You see all this blue information here, it's we're seeing that, okay, the blue here in this object. But our perceptual processes turn this into, what we're seeing is not just a blue stimulation, we're seeing a white paper with blue circle dots with a cube floating in front, okay. You can see that. A white paper with blue circle holes through which you can see a cube. Okay, so we're seeing a hole. Okay, we're not just seeing the blue, but it's looking a little bit different depending on how you look at it, right? Okay, you see the cube floating in front, but you could also see it as a white paper with blue holes through which you can see a cube. So the cube can either be seen as floating in front or being inside of those holes. Okay. You can see a cube sticking out to the top left or bottom right. Okay. So you could see it sticking out here. Okay. You could see it. You could see it sticking out from here. Okay. You could see blue dots. Okay. Maybe that's what you saw initially before I started talking about the cube, but with this X basically changed a lot of things. But without that X, you're much more likely to see, just a bunch of kind of like Pac-Men with angled lines inside of it, right? So all of that, those about different interpretations of the same sensory stimulation. Figure ground perception, very important. Okay, so in most visual scenes, we pick out objects and figures standing out against the background, despite the fact, of course, that the red photoreceptors are in a flat screen setup. Some art muddles this ability by giving us two equal choices about what is figure and what is ground. Okay, so we do this naturally, but we can be fooled. So we can see this as the figure as the white goblet, and then the background is this blue. But it's hard not for it to flip on you, and you see two faces facing each other. Okay, so that's the foreground, that's the figure, and the background is the white. Okay, and that flips. Okay, so our brain is basically coming up with different interpretations. Okay, as we continue to look at it, because it is indeed an ambiguous figure. So figure and ground can be reversed here. This is another nice example that I like. I mean, if you see the black as the figure, you'll see a stepping man, if you will. Okay, but if you see the white as the figure against the black background, you see one arrow going this way, another arrow going that way, and it flips on you. Okay, it's hard to keep it focused on one or the other, which one's figure, which one's ground. Because the way it was put together, the art, it muddles this ability. Okay. Gestalt principles of grouping. So Gestalt, this came from a school of psychology known as the Gestalt School of Psychology, which was very focused on the idea that the whole is different than the sum of the parts. Okay, you've heard that expression before, I'm sure. Okay, and some of the Gestalt principles that fall out of that and that they researched in studies of vision and sensation and perception are proximity. Okay, so the principle of proximity is that we, for example, in this, things that are closer together tend to get grouped together. So we tend not to. We could see this logically just as easily as, whoops, that went too fast. I hit the, okay, as a set of columns or as a set of rows. But we're much more likely to see rows because we get this grouping, pairs of the rows of dashes. Okay, so we see 3 rows. Okay, we tend not, we wouldn't describe that as 5 columns. I'm sorry, we wouldn't, of course not, but we wouldn't describe it as 6 columns. We'd see it as 3 rows. Okay, we perceive things that are close to being a single unit. Then there's continuity. Okay, so we tend not to see, like a triangle here, or parts of 2 sides of a triangle and a triangle there, but rather we see lines that connect 1 to 2. Okay. And 3 to 4. Okay, that's what we naturally see because of the continuity involved. Okay, viewers tend to see elements in ways that produce a smooth continuation. Okay, there's a principle of similarity. So here we tend to see columns of orange and red dots. Okay, similar things, object sharing features tend to be grouped together. So we tend to see this as, alternating columns of orange and red dots. Okay, not as a random pattern or as a bunch of 4 different rows. Okay, closure. Okay, so here, even though this is, we could see it otherwise, but we tend to see it as a horse, right? Okay, closure is this whole idea that we tend to supply the missing elements to close up the figure. Okay, so we're all familiar with the term reaching closure on a problem or a topic or whatever, but in the area of perception, closure has to do with basically completing, okay, the visual scene. Okay, supplying the missing elements. Okay, so that's a form of closure. That's where the term comes from. Great example of closure. Okay, we tend not to see the 3 Pac-Men facing each other. Okay, we tend to very quickly configure this as a triangle. Okay, so we've kind of completed the extension of this triangular shaped thing out into the void of white here, and we tend to see a triangle. It stands out actually in front of us if you look at it for a few seconds as the figure against a background that includes those black balls. Okay, that's what people tend to see there. That's a great example of the principle of closure. All right, organization. Okay, well, the really important aspect of organization. Remember, I said in the past that in a previous lecture that it's really kind of impossible to see things in an unorganized way. Okay, we impose organization. Okay, well, we also impose a form of organization called constancy. Okay, perceiving the environment as remaining the same, even though there's these constant changes in sensory input. So the best known constancies in the study of perception are size, shape, color, and brightness. And we may indeed have a chance a little bit later just to go over those four kinds of constancies in a little bit more detail. But right now, let's talk about depth perception, another aspect of organization. This is our ability to perceive three-dimensional space and accurately judge distance. Okay, a phenomenal ability here. Okay, so where does depth perception come from? Okay, well, there are these fascinating studies that have been done over the years with the so-called visual cliff. Okay, the visual cliff is depicted here. Okay, so you've got a table with a glass top, and immediately under, and for half of the table, immediately under that glass top is this red and white checkerboard surface. Okay, but over here, it's only glass, okay? And the checkerboard is surface is actually on the floor, okay? So we call this the shallow side and the deep side because this creates an illusion, okay, of depth, okay? You know, so here's a little baby crawling over, and their experience would be, you know, here's a cliff, okay, the visual cliff, okay, and the mom's saying, "Hey, come on over," or whoever the person is, the caretaker. So, what happens here? Well, as it turns out, as early as they are able to crawl, okay, babies are very reluctant. They won't cross over from the shallow side. They won't cross over to, in this case, mom, okay, you know, despite the coaxing, okay, because they apparently perceive depth, okay, as soon as a human being perceives depth as soon as they're able to crawl at the very least. Okay, so that suggests that some depth perception might be kind of like, if not built in, that it develops very, very early, this depth perception. Even with animals, if you put for example, a day-old lamb, let's say, because they can walk, they can stand up within a day of birth, okay, and they'll walk around. But if you put it on the deep side, facing the shallow side, okay, it won't cross over. And if you put it on the deep side, so that it looks like it's, you know, on this side where there's glass and looking straight down, the animal will freeze. Okay, it'll just freeze and not move. Okay, there's a suggesting again that if it's not innate to some extent, depth perception is learned very, very early. Okay. Now, how do we do depth perception? Well, depth perception involves both what we call binocular, requiring two eyes, and monocular, requiring one eye, cues. Okay, and there are two major binocular depth cues. Okay, one is called retinal disparity, which involves the separation of the eyes. Okay, causing different images to fall on each retina. And then there's this notion of convergence. Okay, the closer the object, the more the eyes converge or turn inward. Let's look a little more closely. So this is retinal disparity. Okay, I'll let you do that little demonstration. I think it's talked about in your textbook, but but you can get an idea of what the eyes are doing as you focus closer and closer together. In any case, so when the object is near, we turn inward. Okay. Our eyes turn inward. Okay. When it's further away, of course, the eyes have to be, they aren't as turned inward as they might be. So this is convergence. Okay, and basically, what convergence is basically all about is the fact that we get, this is controlled by a muscle, the iris of the eye, okay? And the muscles are connected up in such a way that they send information to the brain, which basically tells you where the eyes are, okay? And therefore gives information about depth. So that's this convergence idea that, which is information conveyed by the muscles of the eye that communicate to the brain how the eyes are focusing. Okay. Now the retinal disparity is that if you look at just look at the at your two at your two fingers like this. If you close one eye, you'll see a different pattern. If you close the other eye, you'll see another pattern. Okay, so the two retinas are getting different images. Okay, and the brain can coordinate that and get a sense of depth based on the two images that the two retinas are presenting. Now, binocular cues, people who have only one eye, okay, they they can't use these cues. There's really not complete convergence. You only got one retina, so the other one can't be compared. So a person who's blind in one eye might have a less depth perception because they can't make use of binocular cues. Okay, but they do have the monocular cues that only require one eye. Okay, so monocular cues has to do with basically cues out there that convey distance, okay, and get interpreted by the brain, okay, in a way that allows us to actually perceive distance in depth, okay. So, for example, when one object appears to block the view of another, we assume that the blocking object is in a position between our eyes and the blocked object, and hence we get a sensation of depth. Okay, that's called interposition. Relative size. Okay, we intuitively know to interpret familiar objects. Okay, whose size we know. Okay, as farther away when they appear smaller. Okay, so the classic little cartoon. I have no depth perception. Is there a cop standing on the corner? Or do you have a tiny person in your hair? Okay, if you had no depth perception, this cop is going to make a much smaller impression on your retina than is this woman, and so the cop's going to look tiny. Okay, and just as close. Okay, if you had no depth perception, but we know about relative size. We know how big people are, the size of people. So when we see a small image of a person in the distance, okay, oh yeah, that's a person, okay. But not only do we recognize that it's a person and the size stays constant, but our brain can help interpret it in such a way that that we actually experience the sense of depth, okay, from this relative size, okay. Um, so even though this is a flat two-dimensional picture, uh, we know these are flowers and they're about the same size as these. Yeah, we know that and we experience that, but we do get the sense of depth. It doesn't look like a flat thing. It doesn't look like small flowers on top of moons. It looks like that's farther away, not just the same size as this. That's the size constant, but also experience it phenomenally as further away. It's a monocular cue. Linear perspective and interposition. So the flowers in the distance seem further away, okay? And so we have this impression of depth, even though we're looking at a flat picture, because the rows, okay, converge, okay? And because of this convergence, okay, our brain reads this as a sign of distance. That's called linear perspective. So the railroad track kind of illusion, okay. So the two red lines meet the retina as being the same size, okay, because they are the same size, okay. But our perception of distance created by the linear perspective, this narrowing, converging of the railroad tracks, which conveys distance, okay? Well, it's conveying distance, but it also tricks us into seeing, okay, this line as longer than this line, when in fact they're not, okay? They're equidistant from the retina. They're coming, they're making exactly the same length image on the retina, but this one is perceived as much as wider, as a longer line than this one, despite the fact that they're the same, because of this conversion, this illusion, this perception of depth, the monocular cue of linear perspective. Okay. There you go. Proof in the pudding. Relative height, we tend to perceive the higher part of a scene as further away. Okay. You get that. Relative height. Relative motion. Get on the, you get on a train, above ground train. So when we're moving, we can tell which objects are farther because it takes them longer to pass by. So something way in the distance is going to take further to pass by than something right on top of us. Okay. So relative motion is another cue to depth. And because we know this, because the brain knows this, it's making an interpretation that not only tells us about distance, but allows us to perceive depth in the scene we're looking at. This is like an extreme example. So a picture, of a moon on a sign close to us as we pass by is going to go right by us, okay? But the actual moon, a couple 100,000 miles away, doesn't move at all. We never pass it. Okay, that obviously conveys a huge sensation of distance. Motion perception. Okay, so I'm going to summarize this. These are all various kinds of cues that we have that basically give us a sense of motion, okay? And our brain's going to interpret things. So an object moving toward us, so we perceive this motion by watching the changing apparent size of an object. It's getting bigger, so that conveys it's coming to us, okay? Okay, so we get the motion perception. Objects moving to one side, okay? Um, I'll leave that to you to figure out from the textbook if you want to. Um, Objects traveling in a more complex path, such as in an arc through the air coming toward us. So baseball players, even dogs, dogs with the frisbees, can run right to where a fly ball is going to land by keeping the ball in a constant apparent position in the sky. Amazing. Okay, perceptual constancy. Okay, our ability to see objects as appearing the same even under different lighting conditions at different distances and angles, that's called perceptual constancy. That's a top-down process. Okay, okay, we have to have a sense of we basically have to have a theory about knowing the size of things and how things are shaped in order for perceptual constancy to sort of work. Okay, so color constancy. Okay, the ability to see a consistent color and changing illumination helps us see the three sides of this object as all being yellow because our brain compensates for the shading. Okay, so we know that's yellow, just like this is. We compensate because we know about shading. Okay, and the brain knows that and it automatically does this for us. So we interpret three same color blue dots, okay, with shades that are not adjusted for shading as being of three different colors. So here we can create an illusion, okay. Our brain's telling us these yellows are all the same, these are all yellow, okay. And so as a result, okay, the shades, when we're not making an adjustment for the blue dots as we are for the yellow dots, and so even though we know these are probably yellow, okay, they're not, and so the same hue of blue looks much brighter here than it does here. Okay, so for color constancy in one dimension creates a little bit of an illusion, okay, for the object within it, within the context. Remember the importance of context. There you go, same color. Shape constancy. This is so important if we're going to navigate through the world. So, objects that we're familiar with, okay, we perceive them as having a constant shape despite the fact that we receive different sensory images as we move, as they move, as the door opens and closes, and so on, okay. But of course, because of this, we may think the red shapes on the screen are also rectangles, okay. Which of course they're not, okay, but our shape constancy compelled us, whoop, that's not what I want to do, compelled us to see the door as rectangular, okay, in all three images, because we know what doors are like when they're open and so on. They're still doors, they're still rectangular. And so even the surrounding of the door, okay, gets carried away with this shape constancy, and we see them as rectangle, but of course they're not. Nature and nurture. We talked about this guy, Mike, and I was wrong actually in a previous narration. I thought I had indicated he had been blind since birth, but he was blind between the age of 3 and 46. Okay, but he's basically grown up with vision, without vision, and then in adulthood he had his vision restored. So as a result, people in this situation can interpret. They could interpret depth, motion, and figure ground distinctions. Okay, um, but could not really differentiate shapes or even faces very well, because that seems to be more of a learned kind of thing. It requires quite a bit of experience. Okay, the development of that, the kind of uh, uh, face detectors part of the brain that we've talked about, part of the cortex that we talked about previously in a previous narration. Okay, we talked about the kittens raised at an early age without seeing horizontal lines, seem unable to learn to perceive such lines. Okay, uh, so if humans don't have full visual sensation experience at a critical period of development, we seem to acquire limits to what our brain can interpret from visual stimuli. Okay, so there are critical periods of development that are necessary to have vision during in order for certain kinds of, shall we say, visual perceptual skills to develop. Okay, so nature's involved. We've seen some of the stuff that seems pretty much built in, but nurture plays a role. Okay, uh, to quite an extent. And finally, we get to perceptual adaptation. Okay, so the fascinating studies done a number of years ago that fascinated me when I was in college, learning about this in a perception class. So researchers long ago developed these apparatus, these glasses, these goggles that basically completely inverted um, what one would see, and completely inverted the world. Okay, and so everything was upside down. Okay, and so initially, okay, they experienced, well, it's completely disoriented. Here's a guy who's just put these kinds of glasses on. He's going to shake the guy's hand, but everything's flipped over, so he's seeing it up there, and in fact, the hand's down there, and there he's shaking at the guy's head. Okay, very disoriented. Okay, as I think, yeah. Um, but as time goes on, and so these people would, the subjects in this research, including the researchers themselves who first tried this out, um, kept this on 24/7. Okay, and gradually they adapted, essentially to the point where the world flipped back up, or shall we say, the upside down world seemed natural. Okay, but in some ways they experience this. So because the brain is working this way, they they come to experience the world as flipping back up. Okay, so that it looks normal to them after a while. Okay, they've adapted. They've had this perceptual adaptation. The brain eventually figured out that things are coming in this way, and but they're, and they're and how they're coming in. Okay, so that at some point the world began to look normal. People could engage in all kinds of activities, even with these glasses on. Um, this particular fellow apparently could learn eventually to fly an airplane wearing these goggles. Okay, even though at first he was completely um, flipped out. Okay, because his world had been flipped upside down. Okay, then when after you've completely adapted, you take them off, and the world for a while seems upside down again. Okay, and then it takes a while to adapt, but it's much quicker to the world as it actually is. Okay, so perceptual adaptation is a fascinating um, aspect of this amazing sensory perceptual system that we have. And that's it for now. So I will sign off.